Hi, I'm Dr. Chad Larson. Thanks for joining me in another episode of Keep It Real. So we all know what an amazing responsibility it is when women are pregnant. They have to keep track of not only their own health, but also the health of their baby. And not only the health of the baby while the baby is developing, but also things that they're exposed to or things that they do or don't do could affect the future health of the baby. And that's an amazing responsibility. Obviously I've never been pregnant, but my wife has been pregnant 3 times, so I was a bystander through that process, and there's a lot to think about, and it is a pretty awesome responsibility. So there's a couple interesting studies that I read recently that I'd share with you that have to do with pregnancy. Interestingly, they're both published just a few days ago this month, and they also both come out of Scandinavia. The first study is out of Denmark, and it was published in the British Medical Journal, which is one of the top tier European medical journals. And here's what they looked at. They looked at over 60,000 women, and they were looking at their diet, something very specific in their diet, which I'll get to in just a moment. But they wanted to evaluate the risk factor of the child developing type 1 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune condition where there's destruction of a certain part of the pancreas that develops insulin, so it leads to blood sugar dysregulation, blood sugar problems. So it's type 1 diabetes, and what they looked at in their diet was gluten consumption. And what they found out is they came up with kind of a scale of average amount of gluten consumption, and it varied from 7 grams per day up to 20 grams per day. And just to give you a little kind of understanding of what that means in real servings, a piece of bread is maybe 4 or 5 grams of gluten. A piece of whole wheat bread and whole wheat pasta, a serving would probably give you 6 or 7 grams of gluten, depending on portion size and that kind of thing. And so the average was between 7 and 20 grams of gluten consumption per day. And here's what they found out. They found out that there's a double increased risk factor for the child to develop type 1 diabetes between the low gluten consumption and the high gluten consumption. In other words, the higher the degree of gluten consumption during pregnancy, the greater the risk factor for the child developing type 1 diabetes. And there's a correlation. As it goes up from 7 grams up to 20 grams, there's a relative increase as the gluten increases of the child developing type 1 diabetes. In fact, between the lowest consumption, 7 grams, and the highest, 20 grams, there's double the risk factor. So that's a really significant correlation. So the researchers were quick to mention, and this is accurate, that it's a correlation, but what's the cause of that? Why is that? Why is there an increased risk factor for the child to develop an autoimmune condition? And so there's a few things to think about. One is inflammation. We know that gluten could be inflammatory, so these inflammatory chemicals could get into the baby and could potentially affect the current and even future health of the baby. Another one is breakdown of the gut barrier. We know that when there's breakdown of the gut barrier or leaky gut, which we know gluten can do, then that could increase certain inflammatory substances to get into the system, and we know that that could affect the future health of the baby. Another one could be disruption of the gut microbiome. Remember, the gut microbiome is the accumulation of all the bacteria in the gut, and there's a certain amount of bacteria that's totally normal and healthy in the gut, but there can be a disruption in that balance, and so gluten could possibly disrupt the balance of the gut microbiome, and maybe that can lead to autoimmunity. So further testing is warranted to go into these different causes and kind of reproduce these same findings and figure this out, because gluten's a very, very common substance that a lot of pregnant women are exposed to. So we should really understand more about how this is a risk factor for women, but it is according to this study. And it's a pretty big subject population of over 60,000 pregnant women. So pretty interesting findings. So the other study is published out of Finland, and it was published in a journal called Pediatric Research. And what this one looked at is also a dietary factor and how it influenced the health of the baby. And what they looked at is they evaluated fish consumption. And what they're really looking for in fish consumption was fatty acids. They're looking at fish oil, basically, the oil in the fish. And we know that those have certain health properties, not only on the woman, but also on the developing baby. So to make a long story short, here's what they found out. They found out that the more fish consumption the woman consumed during pregnancy, and the way they evaluated that was through evaluating a diet diary and also a questionnaire, and also they did a laboratory analysis in the late stage of pregnancy, and then they also evaluated the fatty acid levels of the child after it was born 1 month into life. And so they had pretty sophisticated data on this fatty acid analysis. And what they found out is the women who consumed a higher amount of fish, i.e. they consumed higher amounts of this fatty acid, their children had better brain development. They call it neural development. And what they specifically evaluated was a pretty sophisticated visual analysis. And this is just a research way of evaluating this brain development by evaluating their visual tract. And so what that means is the women who consumed more fish had more exposure to this fatty acid. Their children had better brains, had better developed brains. So just to put in your toolbox, especially you ladies out there, and especially if you're pregnant, diet absolutely matters, your environment matters. I know you know this, but it's just something interesting to keep in mind. This is really recent data, just came out a few days ago. So consider driving down your gluten, and consider fish oil. The study was just on fish. I would think I could probably extrapolate that fish oil would give probably certain benefits, but there could be, you know, other things in the fish that are also providing some benefit, actually eating the fish. So probably some combination of eating the fish and fish oil and the future development, neural development of the child. So again, it's amazing responsibility, and so this is just some food for thought. I'll keep reading you the studies and bringing you the information. Until then, keep it real.